it comes to rounding out that ugly flat butt or putting some meat in the seat, there are two exercises that stand out amongst all others.
It's a routine many of you already know intimately and likely follow with real discipline, day after day without fail. You wake up, lace into your comfortable shoes, and head out for your daily walk, rain or shine, because that's what you've been told to do. For decades, the medical community, myself included, I'll admit, has held walking up as the gold standard of exercise for older adults. It's genuinely low impact, it's accessible to nearly everyone regardless of fitness background, and it does wonders for cardiovascular health specifically. But as we dig deeper into the actual physiology of aging, specifically around muscle atrophy and fall prevention, a more complicated picture emerges than the one we've been presenting for years. Walking, while genuinely necessary and worth continuing, turns out to be fundamentally insufficient on its own for preserving real independence later in life. There's a physiological gap sitting between simply moving through your day and actually staying strong enough to handle it, and that gap is precisely where frailty quietly begins to take hold, often without any obvious warning signs until it's already well underway. The myth of gluteal maintenance. One of the most concerning misconceptions I encounter regularly in my own practice is the belief that walking alone is enough to maintain muscle mass over time, a belief that feels intuitive but simply doesn't hold up under closer examination. This turns out to be anatomically incorrect. Electromyography studies, the kind that measure the actual electrical activity firing through your muscles during movement, using sensors placed directly on the skin, have revealed something genuinely startling about the gluteus maximus, the largest single muscle in the entire human body. During a standard walk on flat ground, this powerful muscle activates to only about 32% of its maximum capacity. That means for the overwhelming majority of your daily activity, nearly 2/3 of your primary stabilizing muscle sits essentially dormant, doing almost nothing to support you. Over time, this pattern leads to something we often refer to clinically as gluteal amnesia. Your brain quite literally forgets how to properly recruit these muscles, simply because they're rarely challenged beyond that low activation threshold day after day, year after year. And the result isn't merely a gradual loss of raw strength, it's a loss of the protective scaffolding that keeps your pelvis properly aligned and your overall balance genuinely secure, the kind of scaffolding you don't notice until it's already given way. What we see in the clinic. We witness the downstream consequences of this constantly in clinical practice, week after week, with patients who did everything they thought was right. Patients who faithfully walk 3 miles a day are often genuinely baffled when they struggle to rise from a low sofa or feel unexpectedly wobbly crossing uneven grass in their own backyard, wondering aloud how this could happen despite all that walking. This happens precisely because walking is a linear, repetitive motion that never actually challenges stability or lateral strength in any meaningful way, no matter how far or how often it's performed. As we age, if we don't intentionally stimulate our fast-twitch muscle fibers specifically, they atrophy at a rate significantly faster than slow-twitch fibers do, quietly falling behind while the rest of the body seems otherwise fine. There is, fortunately, a specific protocol of targeted movements capable of addressing these neglected areas directly, reversing that atrophy and restoring genuine structural integrity throughout the lower body. One particular movement among them, which I'll walk through later in detail, often ends up being the deciding factor in whether a patient can realistically continue living alone well into their 80s. Before we get into the specific biomechanics of these movements, I genuinely appreciate a moment of your engagement here. Please leave a comment below sharing your name, your age, and where you're watching from today. I make a real point of reading through these comments personally, because it's genuinely encouraging to witness a global community of older adults taking proactive, deliberate steps to manage their own long-term health. If you find this information valuable, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue building this conversation together over time. Movement 1. The step up. Let's begin addressing this deficit with a movement that directly challenges the vertical loading of the hip joint. We need to look closely at the step up. While this might initially seem like a trivial action, essentially just mimicking the act of climbing a single stair, something most people do without a second thought in a clinical setting, the ability to perform a genuinely controlled step-up functions as a remarkably potent biomarker for both longevity and fall risk. Here's the key distinction. When you walk, momentum naturally helps carry your body forward through each stride, doing part of the work for you without conscious effort. When you step up, though, you're required to generate real force directly against gravity using a single leg alone, with no momentum available to assist you. This engages the stabilizing structures of both the hip and knee in a way ordinary walking simply never can, recruiting muscle fibers that would otherwise stay largely uninvolved. A study out of the University of Florida found that deliberately practicing this specific movement improved single-leg strength by over 25% in older adult participants, a meaningful improvement achieved without heavy equipment or a gym membership. The critical variable here isn't actually the height of the step itself, it's the quality of control throughout the movement, start to finish. What we're genuinely looking for is the nervous system relearning how to stabilize your entire body weight balanced on a single limb, a skill that quietly atrophies the less it's practiced. The moment you place your foot onto a low platform and press firmly through the heel, you're sending a high-magnitude signal directly to both bone and muscle tissue, demanding real physiological adaptation and response. You're essentially telling your body that it still needs to remain capable of genuine vertical power output, rather than settling permanently into flat ground movement alone. This specific stimulus promotes bone density directly in the femoral neck, a notably common fracture site in older adults, and one of the more serious injuries a person can sustain later in life, while simultaneously forcing the gluteus maximus to fire completely through the full hip extension. If we neglect this specific vertical strength over time, we eventually lose the practical ability to safely navigate curbs, buses, and stairs, gradually shrinking our accessible world down to flat surfaces alone, one avoided obstacle at a time. Movement 2. The glute kickback. Once we understand the importance of vertical strength developed through stepping, we need to turn our attention to posture and hip extension specifically, which quietly deteriorates in ways most people never consciously register. As we age, our bodies tend to curl gradually inward, shoulders roll forward, and the hips remain slightly flexed rather than fully extended, largely as a direct consequence of how much time we spend sitting throughout a typical day, whether at a desk, in a car, or on the couch. This creates a mechanical tightening through the hip flexors positioned at the front of the thigh. Through a physiological process called reciprocal inhibition, when these front-side muscles stay chronically tight, they actually send a chemical signal to their opposing muscle group, the glutes, instructing them to relax and remain lengthened rather than engaging properly when called upon. This turns out to be a genuine disaster for posture over time, one that compounds silently year after year. It directly produces what's sometimes called the senior shuffle, where stride length gradually shortens because the leg simply can't extend fully behind the body anymore during walking. To counteract this specific pattern, we rely on the glute kickback. This isn't merely a simple leg lift, it functions as a genuine neurological reset. By standing tall and extending one leg backward, without allowing the lower spine to arch, we force the glute to actively contract directly against that chronic tightness sitting in the front of the hip. This restores natural range of motion within the hip joint itself, enabling a longer, noticeably more confident stride over time. It also prevents the lower back from taking over work that should belong to the hips during walking, which happens to be a primary cause of nonspecific lumbar pain in patients over 60. Movement 3. The glute bridge. This connection between gluteal weakness and chronic back pain leads us naturally down to the floor or a firm mattress for the glute bridge. This is arguably the single most therapeutic movement available for the aging spine, and one I recommend more often than almost anything else in this protocol. Many of my patients suffer from persistent lower back pain, not because their backs themselves are genuinely weak, but because their glutes have effectively gone to sleep functionally, leaving the spine to absorb work it was never designed to handle alone. When the glutes fail to adequately support the pelvis, the lower back muscles are forced into compensation mode, working overtime just to keep the body upright throughout the day, every single day, without rest. The glute bridge directly fixes this faulty firing order. By lying on your back and lifting the hips upward, you're removing the variable of balance entirely from the equation, which allows you to focus purely on the muscular contraction itself, without the distraction of staying upright or worrying about falling. This makes it a genuinely safe, closed-chain exercise that decompresses the spine while simultaneously strengthening the entire posterior chain. Clinical data suggests meaningful reductions in chronic back pain once this specific movement gets introduced into a patient's routine, since it teaches the body to lift and stabilize using the hips rather than leveraging the vertebrae directly for that work. Ultimately, it's about teaching the brain that the hips are the true engine of movement, sparing the spine from unnecessary accumulated wear over time, wear that tends to compound quietly for years before it ever becomes painful enough to notice. Movement 4. Seated band abductions. However, moving purely forward and backward only addresses half of the overall equation here. We also need to address lateral stability specifically, which is governed primarily by the gluteus medius and minimus, the muscles positioned along the side of the hip. These function as the genuinely invisible muscles responsible for preventing you from falling sideways, working silently in the background every time you shift your weight. Statistically, lateral falls represent the most dangerous category for hip fractures specifically because the resulting impact lands directly on the trochanter of the femur, a structurally vulnerable point that doesn't absorb impact well. Walking does almost nothing to strengthen these particular side muscles, no matter how many miles you accumulate over a week. This is precisely why we introduce seated band abductions into the protocol. By sitting and pressing the knees outward against resistance, we isolate these lateral, stabilizing muscles directly without any real risk of falling during the exercise itself, which makes it an ideal starting point for someone who's understandably cautious about their balance. This movement might seem small, even nearly imperceptible in the moment, yet strength, specifically in the hip abductors, turns out to be the single strongest predictor of successful fall recovery. Here's why that matters so much practically. When you trip unexpectedly, it's the side of your hip that reflexively fires to pull your leg out wide and catch your balance before you fall. If these particular muscles are weak from years of disuse, that protective reflex ends up too slow or simply too weak to actually stop the momentum of the fall in progress. Strengthening them effectively widens your overall base of support, ensuring that even while balanced on one foot, your pelvis remains level rather than dropping to one side, a specific phenomenon known clinically as the Trendelenburg gait. Movement 5. The modified split squat. This progression, moving from basic activation through to genuine lateral stability, leads us naturally to the most complex yet arguably the single most vital movement for functional independence: the modified split squat. In the broader fitness world, you might hear this referred to as a Bulgarian split squat, a name that admittedly sounds intimidating and highly athletic, conjuring images of competitive weightlifters rather than someone in their 70s. But for our specific clinical purposes here, we approach it simply as a supported single-leg stand. The underlying logic behind this movement is rooted directly in the concept of asymmetry. Almost nobody walks through life perfectly symmetrical. We all carry a naturally dominant leg alongside a comparatively weaker one, often without ever noticing the difference in daily life. Over the span of decades, this imbalance tends to quietly grow larger and larger, widening year after year without any single dramatic moment marking the change. When we stand up from a chair or climb a flight of stairs using both legs together, the stronger leg simply compensates for the weaker one, effectively masking the underlying deficit from view entirely. This compensation pattern continues right up until the strong leg itself becomes injured or genuinely fatigued, and suddenly the patient realizes, often with real alarm, that they can't actually support themselves reliably on their own anymore. The split squat strips away this compensation entirely, refusing to let either leg hide behind the other. By placing one foot behind you on a support surface and lowering your weight down through the front leg, you force that single limb to handle the entire load of both stability and strength simultaneously, with nowhere else for the effort to go. It directly challenges proprioception, your body's inherent ability to sense its own position in space without needing to look, a sense that naturally declines with age if left unchallenged for too long. This particular movement effectively integrates everything we've already discussed throughout this protocol: the vertical drive built through the step up, the hip extension trained through the kickback, and the lateral stability developed through the abduction work. It effectively bulletproofs the knees and hips by ensuring that each individual leg remains independently capable of fully supporting your body weight on its own, rather than quietly relying on its stronger partner. When I personally see a patient in their 70s master this specific movement, even working through a genuinely shallow range of motion at first, I know their overall risk of a debilitating fall has dropped considerably. At that point, they're not simply building muscle tissue anymore, they're actively building neurological trust in their own limbs, trust that shows up not just in the gym but in every unguarded moment of daily life. Rethinking what exercise means. Ultimately, the goal behind introducing these 5 specific movements, step-ups, kickbacks, bridges, abductions, and split squats, was never to transform anyone into a bodybuilder, and I want to be genuinely clear about that. The real goal here is to shift your entire mindset regarding what exercise actually means once you've passed the age of 60. We need to move decisively away from the idea that exercise exists purely to burn calories or improve cardiovascular output in isolation, useful as those benefits genuinely are. At this particular stage of life, exercise functions instead as a genuine prescription for autonomy. It's fundamentally about preserving the practical ability to perform activities of daily living, commonly abbreviated as ADLs, entirely without outside assistance: getting up from a chair, reaching a top shelf, carrying groceries up a flight of stairs. When we rely solely on walking as our exercise foundation, we're effectively managing our heart health, which remains genuinely vital, to be clear, and something I'll never discourage, but we're simultaneously neglecting our underlying structural health in the process, the very foundation that keeps us upright and mobile in the first place. The human body remains remarkably adaptive, genuinely regardless of age, far more so than most people assume. We used to believe, as a field, that muscle loss in later life was simply inevitable and entirely irreversible, a one-way decline with no meaningful recourse. We now understand, thanks largely to our growing understanding of neuroplasticity and the ongoing responsiveness of skeletal muscle tissue, that you can genuinely regain both strength and coordination well into your 80s and 90s. But doing so requires real specificity in your approach, not just general activity. It requires deliberately doing the things that feel slightly difficult, the specific movements that challenge your balance within a controlled environment, so that you arrive genuinely prepared for the uncontrolled, unpredictable environment of the real world outside, where there's no instructor standing beside you and no soft mat underneath. Consistency remains the key currency underlying all of this work, more so than intensity ever will be. You don't actually need high intensity here. What you genuinely need is high frequency paired with correct form, applied patiently over time, week after week, without rushing the process or chasing dramatic results overnight. By integrating these targeted movements thoughtfully into your regular routine, you're accomplishing something considerably larger than simply exercising in the conventional sense. You're actively engineering a future for yourself where you remain the pilot of your own life, moving forward with real confidence, genuine stability, and lasting strength, on your own terms, for as long as possible.